Stanford University.
All right. Can you hear me all right? I'm just going to be a couple of minutes. My name is Salim Mohammed. I am the head and curator of the David Rumsey Map Center. I want to welcome you all to this space. This is our first Eitner lecture over here, so we're very excited about this, or excited about Richard and what have you. I just want to make a couple of quick announcements. We will be hitting a one-year anniversary next month. We opened April 19th of last year. So 13th of April, save the date, we're going to have a celebration. Also May 4th, we're going to have a graduate essay competition winner who, using maps from our collection, also speak May 4th, followed by the same day Richard Brown and Paul Cohen talking about revolutionary maps based on their book. So just a couple of things. Housekeeping, there isn't a bathroom on this floor. I mean, there is one. If you absolutely need it, let one of us know. But the main bathrooms are downstairs where you just had some refreshments. So without further ado, Mr. Martin.
Well, welcome to the latest in our series of lectures on classical culture in honor of Lorenz Eitner. My name is Richard Martin, and before the introduction of our speaker for this evening, which I will not do, I just wanted to say a few words about the man for whom the lecture series has been named. The late Lorenz Eitner was Osgood Hooker Professor of Fine Arts at Stanford University. He was born in the Czech Republic to Austrian parents, and he spent his early years in Germany before emigrating to the US at the age of 16. He graduated from Duke University, that's our North Carolina tie-in today, in 1940. During World War II, he served, like so many future classicists, as an intelligence officer with the Office of Strategic Services, ending up at Nuremberg in the Office of the Chief of Prosecution. On his return to the States, Eitner undertook graduate studies in art history at Princeton, and he received his PhD there in 1952. And it was soon thereafter he traveled west, first to Minnesota and then Stanford. He was called to Stanford in 1963 from his position in Minnesota, and he was brought here to chair the Department of Art and Architecture, as it was then known. The job included, without additional compensation, the task of overseeing the administration of the Stanford Museum. And at that time, the museum, I'm not sure anybody remembers, was less concentrated on art, or perhaps it was just more trendily postmodern than anybody realized, because its collections included at that time such material culture objects as a railroad car and a shark embalmed in glass, which was acquired years and years before Damien Hirst was even born. So Eitner refocused this kind of collection, increased the space more than tenfold, refurbished the galleries, acquired important drawings and paintings, and largely made the Cantor Center what it is today. He also oversaw completion of the now recently deconstructed Cummings Art Building, and he built up the art history department through a number of world-class appointments. His own research on European Romantic paintings gained international recognition, especially his work on Géricault. For 25 years then, until he retired from the university in 1989, Eitner chaired the art department. Even upon retirement, he continued to lead an active scholarly life up to the day of his death. In March 2009, it said he was writing, corresponding, and being asked to authenticate paintings for dealers. While he's remembered with admiration as a scholar, an administrator, and entrepreneur, Eitner touched even more souls as a teacher. He would typically have 200 to 250 students in his Art 1 class. His art scholarship combined a universality of thinking with great taste in connoisseurship. Eitner embodied not just passion for fine art, but a love of literature, of humanities, of the ways that help preserve our humane natures, a love of the past, and creative ways to bring it to the contemporary world. Our Department of Classics, I'd like to say, also wants to foster such better loves. And we too, in these days of presentism and imminent barbarism, only compounded by the adulation of all things technical, would like to think that we follow Eitner's example. So it was in this spirit that the department set out 11 years ago to commemorate, in the form of the Eitner Lectures, Eitner's teaching and worldwide reach. That came about through the inspiration and fundamental support of Peter and Lindsay Joost, and I'm pleased to be able to acknowledge them once again this evening for their splendid foresight and ongoing commitment. Peter and Lindsay are modestly sitting in the back. Our speaker tonight joins a line of internationally renowned scholars who have lectured here under the Eitner aegis on the values and problematics addressed by classical culture and its reception. And so now it's my pleasure to turn over the podium to my colleague, the chair of the Classics Department, Grant Parker, who will introduce the speaker tonight.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a huge honor and just as big a pleasure to be introducing Richard Talbot at this year's Eitner Lecture. Richard joins us from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he has been William Rand Keenan Jr. Professor of History and Adjunct Professor of Classics for nearly 3 decades. More recently, he has created and overseen the Ancient World Mapping Center at UNC, which is the leader in online mapping for classical studies. Richard hails from Britain and took both his first degree with a double first and later his PhD at Cambridge, based at Corpus Christi College. He taught first at Queen's University Belfast and then at McMaster University in Canada before heading to North Carolina. His first books were Timoleon and the Revival of Greek Sicily in 1974 and The Senate of Imperial Rome, 1984, which won the Goodwin Award of Merit of the American Philological Association, the premier book award in our profession. Richard's interest in maps was initially manifested in his editorship of the still very useful Atlas of Classical History in 1985. I remember how much I relied on this in my first lectures. And that interest gained new momentum when he was later commissioned by the APA to create a comprehensive new atlas. This appeared in 2000 as the Barrington Atlas of the Greek and Roman world, reappearing as an iPad app in 2013. I see someone brought a copy of the Barrington Atlas along this afternoon. The neatness of these beautiful end products belies the enormous amount of logistic and scholarly effort that went into their realization, which included marshalling more than 200 scholars. Imagine that. And the effort is ongoing, to judge from the infrastructure Richard has created for the collaborative updates and refinements to the Atlas. I'm referring here to the Pleiades project. In the new millennium, following the completion of the original Barrington Atlas, Richard's research interests have turned increasingly to Roman worldviews and map-mindedness. 2 works of note are Rome's World, the Poitinger Map Reconsidered, in 2010, in which he definitively analyzes one of the most important and most enigmatic maps from antiquity and the Middle Ages. In contrast to the large scope of that map, the 17 known surviving Roman portable sundials are the subject of his most recent book, which I just received last week actually, some of them as little as 3 or 4 centimeters in diameter. This is a book called Roman Portable Sundials of the World in Your Hand. Between the Barrington Atlas and its Cadillac proportions and the tiny portable sundials, Richard has been the scholar of Roman cartography, the long, the short, and the tall of it. Witness also the many collected volumes he has edited or co-edited. These include some path-breaking works comparing the mapping traditions of different traditional societies. Those of us that have had the privilege of working with Richard closely know him as a most engaging and generous collaborator whose enthusiasm is matched only by his knowledge and deep expertise. I've learned to make sure that I have a notebook whenever I meet Richard. So many are the bibliographic suggestions that come out of any such meeting. Richard's encouragement of younger scholars over the years has been legendary, both at UNC itself and in the profession generally. Richard is surely the best raconteur of all in classics. Most of all, I'd say, Richard's enormous energy and joy in all things classical is what has given him such a treasured place in the classics, Romanist, and cartographic communities. Richard, we look forward to your lecture, Classical Cartography, Asia Minor, the Kieperts, and World War I. Thank you.
Well, goodness. Your introduction is far too kind. But worse than that, you didn't tell me the half before I came here. I have ascended the stairs, and I am in map paradise. I suppose I suppose I had some idea before coming. I had some platonic vision of where I might be coming, but I had not expected this. This is above and beyond, quite literally. And I would like to begin by congratulating everyone who's been involved in its creation and thanking everyone who has been responsible for bringing me here. I am deeply grateful for this privilege because you have here a really special place. I hope I need hardly tell you. Typically, those of us today who study the past are so proud of our command of geography and so aware of its value that we're puzzled by those societies that functioned without special concern for geography in general and maps in particular. Ancient Greece and Rome are prime examples, and all the more frustrating ones to the modern mind, because in fact both did so well in terms of expanding their territorial reach. Undeniably too, both Greece and Rome did develop some remarkable map-making expertise. I need hardly underline this point at Stanford, I hope, because the important work on the marble plan of Rome done by Jen Trimble, Mark Lavoie and their team is, I hope, so well known. And I'm so pleased that Jen is here. This huge plan, dating to around 200 CE, reproduces in somewhat simplified form on marble the result of a painstaking survey of the city's streets, spaces and buildings at the very large scale of 1 to 240. Results that presumably had been recorded on perishable material like papyrus, now all lost. The plan, however, cannot have been for practical use because it was fixed on a wall with even the bottom of the plan about 12 feet above the floor and the top over 50 feet above. I think these figures are actually too midgety in this reconstruction. I think they ought to be a bit tall, but we do know that the bottom of the plan was about 12 feet above the floor. In the countryside across the Roman Empire, comparable large-scale surveys of cultivable land were made by professional agrimensores who marked out a checkerboard pattern of divisions that are still recognizable today, as here in the Po Valley. These surveys, too, were publicly recorded on durable material like stone or bronze. And we have impressive stone fragments of one inscribed for the colony of Arausio, modern Orange, in the south of France, in Provence. Made around 100 CE at an approximate scale of 1 to 600,000. Much earlier, from the 3rd century BC onwards, Greek scientific thinkers, beginning with Eratosthenes, attempted to calculate the Earth's circumference. and developed the latitude and longitude grid on which any location across the globe can be plotted if you know its coordinates. And this, of course, is a system that we still use today. In this connection, around 150 CE, Ptolemy produced the handbook that we call the Geography, as well as a concise digest of it, the Table of Important Cities. These reference works provide the coordinates of around 6,000 locations, region by region, and they're intended as databases from which maps can be made. Works like Ptolemy's Geography must have been consulted by the designers of the portable sundials that form the subject of my recent book, so kindly mentioned by Grant, because on the reverse of these instruments we find cities and provinces listed, each with its latitude figure. So to make these, you had to find out the latitude figure of each province or city that you wanted to include. We can be sure that some maps were also made as Ptolemy intended, though now all are lost. What you see here is a reconstruction. This has been done by the Ancient World Mapping Center, and it will very soon be released. This is a reconstruction, where you see here, of part of the Table of Important Cities on a projection specified by Ptolemy. An adaptation of this type of map is what must be the basis of a curious, elongated representation of the Roman world, which we refer to, as you have already heard, as the Peutinger map. And my book has a whole website with maps and so on that you have the URL for there. The ingenious designer of this map, probably in the 4th century CE, has taken a Ptolemy-type map of the Roman Empire and beyond, and has then distorted it quite outrageously to squeeze it into a frame which is 27 feet long by 1 foot tall. Yes, you heard that right. 27 feet long by just 1 foot tall. And what's more, the creator has shifted Rome so that Rome is at the center of the map. You see this in diagram form here, and here, of course, is Rome, which is supposed to be the center of the map. The eye-catching result, with the north-south dimension almost eliminated, is again not a map for practical use. Rather, it's an artist's creative illustration of the traditional claim that Rome ruled the world as the Romans knew it. So, Romans were aware of maps and had some uses for them. But still, it's clear and puzzling that their culture never moved to the cognitive level, our level, where maps are made and used as indispensable tools for the practical purposes of administration, development, military campaigns, and so on. Hence, the modern sense of frustration that I began by remarking on. We ask impetuously, why didn't those oh-so-capable Romans make even half-decent maps of their own territories? Well, it's not hard to come up with some general answers to that cry of frustration. One amounts to reminding ourselves how maps beyond a small-scale outline are a very taxing challenge to produce in pre-modern circumstances. More taxing than we are liable to grasp today when advances in technology have so transformed every aspect of map making. Recently, as it happens, in the course of investigating the efforts to map classical Asia Minor before World War I, by classical I mean Greek and Roman, it struck me that I had stumbled unwittingly into an environment where the circumstances and constraints facing a map maker there around 1900, which remember is barely more than a century ago, were in key respects not so different from those that would have faced a Hellenistic or Roman mapmaker 2 millennia earlier. Granted, this claim may sound to you exaggerated, but I think it's justified where practicalities and method are concerned. We can't, of course, compare results, unfortunately, because no Greek or Roman map of any part of Asia Minor that may have been made has survived. However, it may surprise you how little probing is needed to question the reliability of even the best early 20th century maps of Asia Minor. Despite their impressive appearance and painstaking compilation, these maps may in fact offer users considerably less than meets the eye. A cautionary tale emerges, which carries over into the struggles of World War I. I tell it not for the sake of finding fault, but to provide us today with an instructive reminder. I would want to stress that my work on all this is still very much in progress. I really only began it quite recently, and so your comments and recommendations and corrections will be most welcome. I present this very humbly because I certainly don't know it all yet, by far. In the early 20th century, nobody disputed that the best maps of Asia Minor were the 24 sheets of the Carta von Kleinasien, a set compiled by the experienced Berlin cartographer Richard Kiepert and engraved and issued by a well-known Berlin publisher, Dietrich Reimer, initially between 1901 and 1907. And this is one of the original sheets from 1901. I'm sorry that the definition and so on is not as good as it might be ideally, but this is the constraints of what can be shown. And it's true, if you can see the bottom, that the date is missing. For some bizarre reason, they didn't want to date the sheets initially, but it is 1901. Previously, Richard was best known for his mapping of Africa, though he'd never been there, and he only ever visited Asia Minor briefly. Between 1908 and 1915, a revised second edition of each sheet was issued, and now there was a green tint as well that comes into the second edition. Between 1911 and 1915, there was also a third edition of 4 of the sheets. And finally, in 1916, there was a 4th edition of just 1 sheet. And you can see the coverage here from the locator outline. Meantime, Richard, or perhaps I should call him Rickard, but I find it easier to call him Richard. Richard died in 1915. I would just say here, this is a hint to the Rumsey Map Library, that it is very difficult to track down a copy of every edition of every sheet. And I have yet to encounter a library that has them all, and to the best of my knowledge, nobody has yet issued a finding guide. So if there were to be a library that gathered them all and made them available, this would be a good thing. Both Richard Kiepert's coverage and the scale, which is 1 to 400,000, are bold choices. 1 to 400,000 is about 6 to 7 miles to the inch. Both stem from the lifelong obsession that his famous cartographer father, Heinrich, had had with Asia Minor, or in contemporary terms, Ottoman Turkey. Heinrich Kiepert was a Berliner, born in 1818, and trained in both classics and geography. However, he never gained much first-hand experience of Turkey. His one long visit there was for a year in 1841 to 1842. This is the line that covers his itinerary. This was on an expedition that was paid for by the Kingdom of Prussia to undertake exploration and mapping. Both then and subsequently, Heinrich only travelled in parts of western Turkey and the Aegean, and he never seems to have gone further south than Ephesus. Instead, for the many successive maps of all or part of Asia Minor that he produced from the 1840s onwards, what he did was to synthesize the findings of the growing number of travellers there of various nationalities. Some, in fact, commissioned him to draw the maps that they wanted to illustrate the publication of their own findings. And I show you here as an example an American client, a professor at Cornell University, who wanted Kiepert to illustrate with a map his travels in Isauria. This man is remembered today, in fact, for a standard translation that he made of the geographer Strabo. Many other travellers sought Heinrich Kiepert's advice and corresponded with him and sent him reports. Kiepert published guidelines on mapping for travellers. The climax of his efforts was the Spezialkarte von Westlichen Kleinasien in 15 lithographed sheets at a scale of 1 to 250,000, that's 4 miles to the inch, that Reimer issued between 1890 and 1892. And here you can see the locator outline. The coverage extended no further east than Adalia, that's modern Antalya, and even going that far south and east at this ambitious scale of 1 inch to 4 miles to the inch was a stretch, given the inadequate state of knowledge about many areas. This is the sheet that has Eskişehir on it. Eskişehir is there, and you can see, I mean, there's not a lot on this map. There is the railway line, and we'll come back to railways, but that's about as much as was known in mapping terms of the area at that time. And this is the early 1890s, let's remember. To be the first to map Asia Minor in its entirety was Heinrich's ultimate ambition, but he died in 1899 without being able to fulfill it. By the 1890s, there had been a marked increase in the variety and intensity of outside interest in Asia Minor, and indeed in the whole Ottoman Empire, with a view to its exploitation in one form or another, including the production of reliable maps. A German military mission to reform the Ottoman army was based in Constantinople, and its head from 1885 to 1895, Kolmar von der Goltz, kept in touch with Heinrich Kiepert. Germans and other nationalities dreamed of colonizing Asia Minor. As the saying at the time, the quip at the time went, Asia Minor was to be Germany's Africa. Foreign companies secured contracts to build railroads. Russia posed a continuing threat to Armenia and the northeast of Asia Minor, and Britain became very eager to gather military intelligence here. At the same time, all the great powers wanted intelligence about Mesopotamia to the southeast. Rivalry intensified among archaeologists and epigraphers to discover inscriptions and monuments and sites with potential for excavation. On his death in April 1899, Heinrich left the unfortunate Richard with plenty of unfinished mapping commitments that he wanted his son to complete. And loyal Richard duly proceeded to tackle them. The surprise is that he should so soon also embark on Heinrich's ultimate ambition, to map Asia Minor in its entirety and at 1 to 400,000. The explanation is to be found in the two-page brochure written to launch Carta von Kleinasien in October 1901. It introduces another development of the 1890s, namely maps produced by the Ottoman authorities. European cartographers were all too ready to dismiss any Ottoman map as unreliable. But there's no question that during the 1890s, Ottoman military surveyors benefited from French and German training, and that since its establishment in 1880, the cartographic section of the Ottoman General Staff continued to expand. And here are certainly some, if not perhaps all, I don't know, of the Map Commission officers in 1912. This is very much a going concern. What Richard explains in 1901 that he had now secured, I think by accident, was photos of an unpublished map series at 1 to 300,000, covering the whole of Turkey in 40 to 50 sheets, supplied by the Ottoman Ministry of Commerce. It must have taken years to compile these sheets. I have yet to discover anything more about them, I do confess. And I must also say that my new expert contacts at the French Institute of Anatolian Studies and at the University of Istanbul are also baffled. But they're now kindly on the lookout for this map. It can't have been based on any proper survey. It seems that the only published Ottoman civil maps known from around the end of the 19th century are small-scale sketches showing districts and principal towns within a vilayet or province, produced to illustrate the annual salname or administrative registers. They look like this. This is very small scale. We don't know the exact date of this one, but it's in the years before, just before World War I. Richard strove to integrate this great windfall of new Ottoman data with the traveller's findings that his father had been accumulating for decades. On all Richard's sheets, the name of the traveller who supplied information about a route is noted along it. This was standard cartographic practice at the time, and perhaps was the most practical that could be done on maps of this type. His list of travellers is an impressive dossier. There are about 180 names in all, with as many as 30 on a single sheet. Even so, the notations are spotty, and often it's impossible to be sure where the stretch associated with a traveller begins or ends. A kind and sharp student at the Ancient World Mapping Centre, Laura Robeson, highlighted for me on a couple of sheets all the routes and where the travellers' names are mentioned. You really do need to highlight. That's what these funny loops are. That's where the traveller's name is actually mentioned. And you can see that in some cases, we've put a dashed line because this is where we're not really quite sure whether Kiepert meant that we're supposed to associate that part of the route with the traveller named earlier. It may be that Laura and I have been rather cautious in our presumptions, but we decided not to second guess too much. To check further, any user would need to consult publications by the travellers whose bare names are listed without further details. This is what it looks like on the second of those two maps that I've just featured. Of course, I want to chase up all these 180 travellers, but I can tell you that's, again, not an easy quest. As some of them, it's clear, never published anything, so we can't really find out more about what they had to say. And there are also 4 rather opaque catch-all categories, and you can see 3 of them here. English officers, railroad engineers, engineers in the Turkish service. I think that means road engineers. And then there's a 4th one, which is Russian officers. It doesn't come on this sheet, but it comes on some others. These categories alone serve to remind us that the Kieperts were as much preoccupied with mapping Turkey in their own time as in antiquity. They fully shared our interest in the past, but sheets limited to classical Asia Minor, such as the Barrington Atlas provides, were out of the question at this date. The classical period is at least privileged insofar as Greco-Roman names of settlements and physical features are marked conspicuously by Kiepert in full capitals, besides their modern equivalents in capitals and lowercase. Various ancient names for major rivers and mountain ranges are even included, sometimes with the relevant author's name in parens to follow. So you can see on this detail. This is the second of the highlighted sheets that I showed earlier. You have the detail. Here is Xenophon cited for the name of the river Tigris at this point. And here is Strabo, cited for the name Antitaurus here. So you can tell that antiquity is very much in the map maker's mind. And these details, I think, give you a bit more of a sense of how the maps appear. On its completion in 1907, the first edition of the Karte von Kleinasien was hailed by an admiring Leipzig colleague of Kiepert's as a monumentum aere perennius, a monument that'll last longer than bronze, in Horace's words. And we may agree that, yes, the maps do appear impressive and definitive. Indeed, the sheer density of data in some areas is maybe more than the scale can comfortably accommodate, perhaps up here. By contrast, the many areas left blank are cause for concern, but at least they are honest indicators of the still unknown. For reliable assessment of how far the mapping truly is definitive, experts with first-hand knowledge of the terrain are called for. And there are 2 whose observations I would like to bring to your attention. The first is the Scottish classicist, epigrapher, geographer, Sir William Ramsay, who travelled extensively in the summers in Central Asia Minor during the late 19th and early 20th century. And in true Scottish fashion, he was not slow to articulate his opinions bluntly. He offers no more than a 1-paragraph digression in a book published in 1906, but he does, it must be said, make striking points about the Konya sheet, which was the first of the 2 that I had highlighted. And this sheet came out in 1901. And we might just look at what's in yellow. And this is Ramsay very much in his characteristic kind of style. It's quite extraordinary how erroneous Kiepert's new large-scale map of Turkey is in this region. And it's difficult to describe the complication of error into which he has fallen. Some details. I might go on for a column in this strain, and Ramsay certainly could, but it is useless. The country has never been surveyed. Kiepert has only loose and careless notes of travellers to go on, and often their descriptions are so inaccurate that they seem to be describing different roads when they have really been traversing all the same path. For every mistake in Kiepert's map, there is a foundation in the carelessness, or I should rather say, the deadly fatigue and weariness of a traveller. The only wonder is that Kiepert has been able to make a map that is so good. I mentioned the seriousness of the mistakes, not for the sake of fault finding, but of warning. The absence of a full triangulation survey that Ramsay remarks upon is correct. For Asia Minor in its entirety, that would of course be an immense project. Asia Minor is, well, give take, about 300,000 square miles. It's a project which, in fact, the Ottoman General Staff only began in the mid-1890s for limited areas in the west and northeast, both of them war zones. And the General Staff wasn't able to complete the triangulated survey until the 1940s. Both Britain and Germany had toyed in the late 19th century with the idea of commissioning a survey of their own, but both rapidly rejected making such a costly, long-term intrusion into a foreign country. So pretty much the only reliable surveys made in most of Turkey by the time of World War I were the limited ones of railroad engineers, who by definition for each line and its gradients had to measure distances and heights precisely. And so data from a railroad survey was of exceptional value for anybody attempting to map the region through which a line ran. And that's why I gave you on the poster a railway photograph, because for mapping, the coming of the railroads is the game changer. That is we often think today, I think, in our technological era, that for mapping, the big game changer is aerial reconnaissance, but it's not. For Asia Minor, to be in the 19th century anyway, it's the coming of the railway that makes so much difference. And I have to say, from a selfish point of view, this was an easy photograph to bring in because I took it as a student in 1970 on the way to Baghdad by train, and I proudly add third class. There were 3 classes on the railway in those days, and you could go the whole way third class. Don't try that today. It cannot be done. But we should remember that even by the end of the 19th century, railroads had not spread far eastwards into Turkey. A line had reached as far as Konya when Kiepert's sheet was published. Kiepert's Konya sheet was published in 1901, but the line went no further. And likewise, a line had just reached Angora or Ankara, but again, no further. And very little of the notorious Baghdad Railway, and this is part of the Baghdad line, very little had been built at the end of the 19th century, and this line would not actually be finished until 1940. So, for the most part, as Ramsay rightly says, the mapmaker was perforce reduced to working from traveller's notes of variable quality, or if you like, in a word, from itineraries. Hence my sense, mentioned at the beginning, that the environment for mapmaking in most of Turkey in the early 20th century was still comparable to that of classical antiquity. From surviving testimony, there can be no question that many Romans' worldview was moulded in part by highway itineraries. In other words, lists of stopping points with the number of Roman miles between each. In the most informative lists, the stopping points were categorized into town, which is Kieperts, into major stopping point. This might have filling station plus a Motel 6 or something. That's a Mancio. Whereas there's minor stopping point, which is a mutatio, a place which will have no more than a coffee shop, but probably not facilities beyond that. In the 1980s, an Italian scholar, Pietro Ianni, provocatively argued on the basis of this kind of testimony that Roman worldview was hodological, based on the hodos, the road. And it was, in other words, it was one-dimensional. It was just lines. It was one-dimensional. I think that claim is unduly extreme because there's no doubt that Romans were aware and took into account major physical features like great rivers and mountain ranges. But still, to integrate all the different types and levels of awareness into a reliable map presents a daunting challenge. A further dimension of such a challenge for map making, both in the classical period and the earlier 20th century in Asia Minor, is that travellers seldom had at their disposal the means to make accurate distance measurements, be that along a route from A to B or the elevation of a mountain range or peak. To be sure, by the early 20th century, instruments with this capacity were available, but they were delicate, and in the rough travelling conditions in Turkey, they were all too prone to suffer damage, and then they couldn't be repaired on the spot when they broke down. For road distances, the epigrapher John Anderson, another Scot who was actually Ramsay's pupil, hoped that he had brought a sufficiently robust device for use on his venture into Pontus in 1899. And he explains, where distances are precisely stated, they are calculated from measurements made by means of I don't quite know how to pronounce this word because we don't have it anymore, do we? But a trochymeter, a trochometer. This is from the Greek trokos, of course, it's a wheel. From a trochometer attached to the wheel of the wagon which I used for the conveyance of my baggage. These measurements show that the distance represented by an hour is a very variable quantity. 1899, we ask, but this could be 99. This could be 199. This could be the Roman period, not the end of the Victorian era. And surely one of the things that this brings back to the classicist's mind is the hodometer, which was described by Vitruvius and by Hero in the first centuries BC and AD respectively. This is a gadget probably invented in the 3rd century BC and then just a little bit too late, unfortunately, to help Alexander's Beimatists, because they too were the ones who tried to work out the distances that Alexander traversed. Measurement of distance by hours, which was the standard method in Ottoman Turkey, brings to mind the flexible ancient units, such as the Persian parasang. If you've ever suffered through Xenophon's Anabasis, it's full of parasangs. And if you know the 1st century inscription from Sagalassus in Galatia, you'll be familiar with the Greek skoinos. This is an inscription about the use of the imperial vehicle service. Anderson, as well as later actually British military intelligence, does persist with the use of the trochometer, but alas, at the outset in 1899, it wasn't a great success. He's honest about this. Soon after passing the summit, we found the road washed away, and in order to find a path for our wagon, we had to ascend on the left. Here we unfortunately lost our way, so that my record of distances was destroyed. But the whole distance from Tuzlu Burun to Çorum is about 6 hours. So we go back to the standard Ottoman way of expressing distance. It's about 6 hours. I don't know about today, but traditionally in the 20th century, in Greek villages, the distance from village A to village B is 4 cigarettes. I'm told in Newfoundland the fishermen did it in pipes. It's 3 pipes from port A to port B. And this is the kind of map that appears. This is obviously a very much itinerary map that appears in Anderson's journey. I'm sorry it's not very good quality. I took this the other day in the map room of the British Library. They very kindly nowadays do allow you to take photographs, but there's no tripod and no flash and so on, so you just have to do your best, and this is not too bad. The plain truth is then that even Kiepert couldn't have wholly reliable distant figures to hand, nor would distances calculated from his line work necessarily be accurate. In addition, in only a few exceptional instances can he show elevation with the use of contour lines. Instead, the best that he can really offer is a sort of generalized mushroom-like representation, and you can see it here. The French cartographers of the time referred to these as champignons. These were mushroom bits of the map. Inaccurate measurement of distance could even lead to a town with the misfortune to be located near a sheet line being shown on the wrong sheet. Castamuni, or modern Kastamonu, was first located on A4, which is the Sinob sheet in 1901, but Kiepert was rather distressed to discover later that it ought to be located further west, and so when A3 came out, not till 1907, which was the Zafaranboli sheet, Kastamonu has moved. It's moved a bit further west, because that's where it ought to be. And then that finished the first edition in 1907, and the first map of the second edition, which was produced very soon after the following year, was a revision of A4 with Kastamonu removed, because it ought not to be there. The second assessor of Kiepert's work that I draw your attention to is Guillaume de Gerfanion, a French Jesuit in his 20s, who wrote a dense and frankly remarkable review of the first edition of the Carta von Kleinasien for the Paris journal La Géographie in 1909. There could hardly be a better qualified assessor. Since 1903, Gerfanion had lived year-round in Turkey in his capacity as an instructor at the Jesuit college in Tokat in Pontus. He had travelled sufficiently to comment on as many as 10 of Kiepert's sheets from personal observation. And Gerfanion was a cartographer in his own right, because he knew what he was talking about. And his own map of the region traversed by the Yeşil Irmak, the ancient river Iris on which Tokat lies, was eventually published in Paris in 4 sheets in 1913. And you notice from up here that the prime meridian is Paris, it's not Greenwich. This is a great rarity, but they're wonderful, they're marvellous sheets. Gerfanion, in reviewing Kiepert, refers to all the problems and limitations I've been mentioning. He has a sense of humour, and he quotes Ramsay's digression with relish. He expresses confidence in the British Admiralty's surveys of coastlines and in railway engineers' surveys. But he has a lot of fault to find with Ottoman maps, and he stresses the alarmingly variable quality of travellers' itineraries. The problems he sees arising in consequence include inaccurate line work, misplaced villages, garbling of names that lead to the same village being marked twice. Also, he points out towns and large physical features like long rivers can have more than one name. Reliance on interpreters may lead to names being misunderstood. And then, to add to the confusion, European languages adopt different conventions for transcribing them. In short, as he says, he's very good at one-liners, and he obviously has a wry sense of humour. Les appellations géographiques n'ont rien de fixe en Asie Mineure. There's nothing fixed about geographic names in Asia Minor. And the kind of precision that the European mapmaker wants just doesn't exist among the locals. Il est difficile d'obtenir des montagnards les renseignements précis qu'on désire. give me precise, don't witter, don't haver, give me precise information. But this just doesn't exist in the conception of the locals who are not map conscious. Above all, Gerfanian points out what a weakness it is of maps pieced together in the way that Kieperts have to be, that they're based on the accounts of travellers who each have an itinerary limited inevitably to the narrow band of country which they traversed and which they saw, like Anderson's itinerary map. An attempt to represent what lies unseen just beyond may be right, or it may be wrong. And so such a map will turn out to be misleading. A truly unfortunate example of such rashness confusing classicists for decades is cited by John Cook in his splendid book about the archaeology and topography of the Troad, where Troy is. This is terribly embarrassing because the perpetrator was, of all people, Heinrich Kiepert on that long trip in 1841-42. The misfortune of the survey was that Kiepert mapped the very difficult interior of the Troad in January, when the weather seems to have been bad, and he must have had to rely on guesswork for the areas that he couldn't see. And he and his successors never realized how conjectural this survey was. They're altogether too confident in the laying down of mountains and watercourses. Notably, the Homeric expert Walter Leaf, who visited the Troad in 1911, convinced himself on the spot that Heinrich was wrong. But Leaf could do no more than express frustration that he lacked the time and the skill and the resources to prepare a better map. The progress of World War I led Britain to show increasing concern for Asia Minor. The intelligence division of the War Office was already actively mapping east of longitude 36, with a series at 1 to 250,000, which began in 1901. So 1901 was too soon to make any use of the Carta von Kleinasien. This series, IDWO 1522, wasn't completed in its 50 sheets until 1917. The notable range of sources used was listed at the bottom of each sheet. You can't really see that, you can't read that, they're here, but you get a sort of general idea of what one of these sheets looked like. This is the first edition of 1901. Many sheets were then revised during World War I, not least to take into account the new data furnished by Kiepert in the Carta von Kleinasien. And if you look at these two, I'm afraid again these were taken in the map room of the British Library, so they're not marvellous, but if you compare this first edition of Melatia, I mean look particularly over here, and you can see by comparison the revision has many more places which have come in, and that's the result. They've been taken over from Kiepert. From this series, other maps at the smaller scales of 1 to 500,000 and 1 to 1 million came to be derived after all the sheets of Carta von Kleinasien had appeared. The availability of those sheets was fortuitous because for west of longitude 36, so little else had been produced. A British Asia Minor series at 1 to 250,000 to cover Turkey west of 36 was planned as early as 1908, but initially only the sheets for Gallipoli and Constantinople and Izmit were produced. They came out in 1908. Not till 1915 and 1916 were 40 more sheets covering the south and west produced, and the final 18 sheets for the whole of the centre and the north didn't come out until 1919. And you can see, again, it's not marvellous, but you can see what one of these sheets looks like. This series lacks any statement of sources, but sample comparisons reinforce the suspicion that the British cartographers, in their haste, pretty much just copied Richard Kiepert's work. They rescaled it, of course. They omitted the travelers' names en route, though they kept some of the classical place names, and they converted the transliteration of Turkish names from German style to English. And I show you this detail because it gives you an idea of the work, and I particularly draw your attention to this, Sandama Halbinz. And whoever did that didn't realize that Halbans isn't a funny Turkish name. It's the German abbreviation for peninsula. And so it was left that way. I hate to say this is not sexist, but it was probably a female working in the Royal Geographical Society in London, because they were the people and that was the place where most of this work tended to be done. I don't mean that as a put down. I mean, that is the way it was done. But this is one that slipped through. In the 1 to a million series, the sources are stated, or rather, in the case of many of the Asia Minor sheets, it's a single source, and this is typically what it says on the bottom of the sheet. Compiled from the Carta von Kleinasien and Kiepert. Well, it says with much additional information, but I'm not sure there was. And of course, it makes the point. Turkey in Asia is not topographically surveyed, and the detail is unreliable. The 5 commonly termed Admiralty handbooks that the Naval Staff Intelligence issued in 1918 and 1919 for British forces, finding themselves having to operate in Asia Minor, all recommend Richard's series of maps as a resource. And sometimes, in effect, it's the only resource. I mean, they mention it here, plus these 2 British series, but they don't add that these 2 British series are actually just copies of what Kiepert had done. And for the most part, the handbooks consist of Roman-style itineraries, accompanied by comments which demonstrate marvellously how ramshackle connectivity was in Asia Minor. And do look just at the headers. These are 2 quite separate pages. The distances are estimated from the times noted by the chief authority used. So the chief authority said this is 2 hours, so they then guessed that's so many miles. For some distance, the route may not be that usually taken because the traveller whose account has been followed had apparently missed the regular and better road. Oh, well, yeah, right. The greater part of this route is merely a track. It doesn't appear to be passable for wheels, not in regular use. The main authorities used are archaeological reports, and the route detailed in places may not be the track most commonly used. The distances are calculated from the times noticed by the various travellers and can only be regarded as approximate. In the event, perhaps thank goodness, aside from landing at Gallipoli and later occupying Constantinople, British forces never did invade Turkey during World War I. But it is ironic to reflect that had this happened, the Brits would have relied so much on a German map series. And I am appalled to tell you, I only found this out last week, that they might have done the same if they had been called upon to invade Turkey early in World War II, because I found in the British Library a reprint of one of the Western Turkey sheets at 1 to 250,000 that the War Office made early in 1940. Maybe it's just as well they invaded Norway rather than Turkey at that time. Now, to be sure, the kind of plagiarism and reuse of geographic data that I've been talking about didn't trouble cartographers. And in his, to put it mildly, ebullient presidential address in 1915, the president of the society, the irrepressible Douglas Freshfield, says, and there's a lovely misquote here. I don't know whether this is a typo or whether his hexameter scansion wasn't very good. War has been a process in the upward march of mankind, and more than at any time, it's essential that those who are compelled to its cruel arbitrament should put on the whole armour of science, both in its temper and its appliances. On this point, and perhaps this alone, fas est ab hoste docere. Of course, those who know their Ovid will be aware that there should be an et here. Fas est et ab hoste docere. It's like Timeo Danaeos et dona ferentes, and no branch of science enters more closely than geography into the art of war. Yes. And there's no apologies about this. Several of the IDWO 1522 sheets list among their sources at the bottom Turkish staff map captured in 1915. Yo, we got the enemy map and we have cheerfully incorporated all the data from that. But the habit is at least as old as Ptolemy, who at the beginning of his geography is fiercely critical of his predecessor Marinus, but then states quite candidly that he is taking over Marinus's data pretty much wholesale. And we can't check that because we no longer know anything about Marinus, who's totally lost. In the case of Kiepert's Carta von Kleinasien, there is a further final, all but forgotten irony. By 1908, the expanding cartographic section of the Ottoman General Staff had decided on a program of urgent action to remedy the acute lack of maps of Turkey. The first temporary stopgap that they resolved upon was to take Kiepert's series, rescale it to 1 to 200,000, pretty much as the British would do later, change all the names into Arabic script, and reissue the sheets for themselves in this form. Assuming that the same sheet size was used, that would require making as many as 96 sheets. How many were actually made, I don't know, but I suspect they all were. I haven't yet seen any, but I think that the French Institute of Anatolian Studies in Istanbul has some. Later, by 1915, the decision was taken to reissue 16 of the 24 sheets of Kiepert's Carta von Kleinasien at their original scale, at their actual 1 to 400,000 scale, but with all the names in Arabic script. And this, I know, work was done for because a sample was published in the Journal of the Istituto Geografico Militare in Florence, in 1920. And this is the sample, and I've put next to it the original of Kiepert that is being copied here. 1920, of course, is that curious, very brief period when, as you may know, the Italians actually occupied Adalia or Antalya. So, to conclude, briefly, once more with irony, Richard Kiepert's mapping of Asia Minor, for all its definitive appearance, in fact suffers from a patchy method of compilation and an inability to be precise. Fundamental problems that presented a challenge to Greek and Roman mapmakers as much as they did to their earliest 20th century counterparts here, and indeed, let's recognize, in many, many other parts of the globe. Richard Kiepert's cartography, we might even dare to claim, is hardly more than classical cartography. We should certainly admire his persistent efforts to overcome the problems, but we should also appreciate the sound reasons that his classical predecessors had not to be quite so ambitious. Thank you.
Maps, or the relative absence of accurate maps in the Roman and Greek period, a result of the presence of another form of geographic information, namely the travelogues, the Homer Odysseys. In Roman times there were periphery of the Eritrean Sea. There were all sorts of other ways of communicating geography. And in fact, if you look at the Arab world, the Arab travelers and traders also didn't use maps. They used narrative. And the only reason that maps have really taken over from the narrative is that with contemporary mathematics and science, they're more accurate. So, in other words, there was not really a great need for the accurate map in the classical period.
Yeah, I completely agree with your first point. The second one, I think I would beg to differ. And I think the other reason I would add, we have to remember that the ancient world, even in Roman times, is, to use the modern term, is tremendously devolved. The Romans hated administration. They didn't want to get involved. They were classic modern tea partiers. They wanted to minimize the role and intrusion of government. They wanted to leave it all to the local level. And their idea was that as long as local communities didn't make trouble, they were welcome, and indeed they were expected to go on running their own affairs. And so, if you're in the world of the city-state or the tribe, the people within a fairly restricted area, you were born and bred there, man and boy. That you knew what that area looked like, and you didn't necessarily need to have a horizon that was much larger. And so you don't need a map of what is entirely familiar to you. It's only when this is not true of all societies, perhaps, but it's only when you get an administration which wants to be very intrusive over a much larger region that maps can come to be very worthwhile. And that's, of course, certainly in the history of Europe, that's really what Louis XIV commissioned for France. And you may know that he caused horror, that locally communities were extremely hostile to the surveyors coming along and making this record, because they realized rightly that this was going to mean intrusion from Paris, which they didn't want. And Louis, when he was shown, you remember the famous story, when he's shown some of the results of what the Cassini brothers are cooking up for him, and he sees France and he says, my gosh, France is 1/3 bigger than I ever thought it was, because he didn't have an accurate overall vision. But the Roman emperor doesn't want to interfere, for the most part, locally, and so that need for maps is absent.
Might not the Roman equivalent of the railroads have been the roads?
Yes.
And the army building them?
Yes.
And can't we conjecture at least that the army had maps?
Oh, seducer, oh, you're trying to make me say things that, no, we can't. No, I know. I know that in all kinds of modern movies and so on, The Life of Brian, etc., where he goes on about the roads, it's always the roads. No. Get away, seducer. No, tempter. That's very easy to do, but it's not the case. No. Now, one question you could ask, and I'm frightened, actually somebody earlier at the reception did ask me this and made me very frightened. So I'll now put it back to you before he causes trouble. One question you could ask, and that is, how was the surveying of the roads done? How were they laid out? Now, it may well be the case that in some instances the Romans, of course, took over and used existing tracks that had been there for a long time. But they certainly did also survey and lay out new roads. And that's a very good question that we do not have, that we're left to conjecture. But they certainly are the Roman equivalent of the railroads in an area like Asia Minor in the late 19th century. Yeah.
What was the impact of the use of Kieperts maps on dividing up of the Ottoman Empire except for Turkey after World War I?
Of dividing up the Ottoman Empire except for Turkey? Not very well. That you're asking me to go beyond my scope, of course. As far as I'm aware, the answer to that is not very great, because where, as you know, the real division and conflict occurred was in areas like Palestine, to use modern terms, modern Israel, Jordan, Iraq. There, that series of Kiepert's Carta von Kleinasien did not extend so far south. It's true that Kiepert had made the maps commissioned by Max Freiherr von Oppenheim at the end of the 19th century, and those were extensively used by all the great powers in the early period of World War I. But by the time we get to 1916 and 17, the powers were so involved there, particularly the British, that they really are creating their own new data. I mean, there's no question about that. And I should indeed put in a plug for Gertrude Bell, even though many of the men didn't like her. Gertrude Bell certainly did contribute a great deal. And there is one map, I can't remember quite which series it is, but fascinatingly, it has in the sources, it says at the bottom, I think it's 1917, one of the sources is an aerial reconnaissance made by Gertrude Bell. Now, that is, of course, another game changer for maps coming in, the contribution of aerial reconnaissance, which hadn't, until World War I got going, just wasn't a practical proposition.
As you were talking about the trocheometer and
is that how we should pronounce it?
that's how I'm going to pronounce
Okay, good, go for it.
and the varying lengths that it would record, it reminded me of the Roman hour, which would vary in length according
Good
to the time
parallel,
of the year.
good parallel, yes.
And it just, as somebody who spent a lot of time thinking about the ways they measured things
Yeah.
In the ancient world, what have your observations been about this tolerance for inexactitude and how that played out in their worldview? The things
That's a very, very good question, and thank you very much for linking up time and distance, and sort of time and space. I think we have to envisage a world where, and this is very difficult for us, and I feel extremely embarrassed about saying this in Silicon Valley, where after all, if ever there were exactitude and so on, this must be the home of it. But there isn't this passion for being precise. That you can get along fine by being fuzzy. The hour is a flexible unit, as you've said. As far as we know, nobody ever thinks of any unit of time that is shorter than half an hour, and it's typically a full hour. And that's very fuzzy, and it's the same for distances. And to be able to say that to go from A to B is a journey of give take 5 hours, sure, that's. And it's not as if the restaurant's going to close bang on 5 p.m. and we won't have our tea if we don't get there first. I mean, there is no bid on eBay that's going to expire at 7:14, or the commuter train. If we miss the 8:21, oh drat, we won't get another. It isn't like that. It's just not that kind of world. And I think here, surely, sorry if this is stating the obvious, I apologize, but I think here we have to realize that we are the exceptions. We're the ones with the problem, that we don't understand this kind of society with these sorts of rhythms and outlook, because after all, these are the rhythms and outlook of most people in the world, well into the 20th century. There is a lovely book, I should advertise other people, well perhaps I should advertise other people's books. I don't know whether you know it, there's a lovely book published by Harvard about 18 months ago by Vanessa Ogle, who I think is a professor at Penn, and it's all about the sort of transition of time in many societies, particularly Muslim societies actually, and in India, going from people who have their own quite different rhythm of time, and then European imperialist colonialists come along, they want to introduce their own, very precise sort of time with daylight savings and so on, and that goes down very badly with the local population because it just doesn't mesh with the way their society functions. And there's a report by a traveller, he's actually, I think he's another of these presidents of the Royal Geographical Society who goes travelling in, yes it is I think sort of modern Czechoslovakia, Austria, in rural districts, and he says as far as he can tell, local people have no unit of time shorter than half an hour. So again, we're back in Rome.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Richard. That was really fascinating and so amazing, and I hope my question is not going to seem like a bit of ingratitude because I'm about to say aren't maps horrible. Okay, so one of the assumptions we make in our world is that maps are here to help us.
Yeah.
They are transparent sources of information. We use them to navigate, we get around.
Yeah.
Okay, so in one of my classes, we've just been reading a bit of Ibn Battuta, the 14th century Arab traveler who traveled all over the Muslim world. And your really vivid account of how these maps are made, if you don't survey the landscape, reminds me of Ibn Battuta, right? This notion of the route, but also the route that depends then on the social and commercial interactions along the way, right? There's this whole web, there's this whole network. The map is a human thing.
Yeah.
And then, of course, one thing that maps do is take away that need for human knowledge and for human interaction.
Yes.
So with Ibn Battuta, when he first sets out, he's trying to do the Hajj, so he knows where he's trying to get, he's trying to get to Mecca.
Yeah.
And of course, there are all these stages along the way, and people know this, but he's dependent on them. So once we get maps like this, do they destroy that?
Yes, of course, because they impose a layer, an overlay of false precision and fixity that isn't really there. And you don't necessarily want it to be there. And then you get people like us. And again, I think we moderns, we Westerners are very much the exception, that we admire these maps and we want to take them at their word. When in fact, if we, as I've been trying to do, if we probe a little bit into how they are, well, to use the Victorian term, how they are constructed, we quickly discover that it isn't an assemblage of precision data at all. And therefore we have in a sense been misled. We've been conned, and we're perhaps too simplistic, too optimistic in our outlook.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.